We are doing this sermon series called Living on Purpose. And the truth is, we all want to live lives of purpose, don't we? We all want to, make sure that doesn't, there we go. We want to live a life that makes a difference, makes an impact. We want to do something that leaves a lasting impression. Last week we looked at Dorcas. Dorcas, this woman who simply didn't have much, but she simply used what she had. Remember the question that we asked, what has God put in your hands? And Dorcas simply, her simple response, she had needle and thread. And somehow she was able to work for the glory of God by making things, by making clothes to give to the poor, to put on those who didn't have. This week we're going to look at Cornelius. Cornelius, who is a Roman centurion, who is actually an officer, and he's not a high official, but he is very respected in his community. It's kind of interesting. They actually prioritize pointing out that he is a member of the Italian cohort. By the way, there's nowhere you can go to really, you're gonna find Italians everywhere, aren't you? You find Italians mentioned in the Bible here. This Italian cohort is mentioned as being probably a regiment of archers. And they're well enough known that 20 years later in other texts, Roman history texts, they're mentioned as serving in Syria. So this is a group that's been around and continues to be around and actually lends credibility to this section of Scripture. But who is Cornelius? He's not a Jew. He's Italian. Probably grew up with a very different faith. Would have most likely been polytheistic, believing in multiple gods, probably even the Roman gods of the time, that was still prevalent. That was part of how he would have grown up. That would have been his culture and what was ingrained. Kind of like some communities around here, you go to one community and it's going to be primarily Catholic. You go to another community, it's going to be primarily Methodist or Presbyterian, Reformed. You name it, there's going to be a particular kind of faith leaning of a specific community. I want to point out that he is an outsider. He is not Jewish, and he would have been seen as an outsider. And for a pious or religious Jew, it would have been totally inappropriate. It would have been like making yourself unclean to even associate with or to communicate with somebody who is an outsider. And in fact, let me also point out, at this point in time, Christianity is not a thing. Understand that? The disciples are Jews. Jesus was a Jew. They all believed they were Jews. They had just found the Messiah. They had found the fulfillment of their faith in Jesus Christ as the Messiah who had been prophesied and had come. And so they were still living by their rules and by their laws and by all the history that God had written down in their Old Testament laws, in the Torah and the prophets. So it's interesting. In fact, remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about how Jesus went to this Samaritan woman at the well and was talking to her when the disciples come back. You remember their reaction? It was like, oh, Jesus is talking to a Samaritan. They're not clean. He can't do that. It was still so ingrained in them that there's this barrier that they were surprised that Jesus would talk to her. And in fact, Peter himself in this passage reminds us how much of a gap, a cultural gap there is here. When he says to the group, when he first comes together and this big group is waiting there for him, the first thing he says is, now you yourselves, all of you know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So Peter's coming from one context. Cornelius is coming from another context. There's this huge cultural barrier. There's this huge cultural gap that will not even let him communicate. In fact, let me put it in today's context. There was even a little bit of tension, conflict, fighting. Remember the zealots, even Judas was a zealot who was ready to get rid of every other nation and keep them out. It would be like bringing together today someone who would associate as a white supremacist and an African American as best friends. or as at least beginning a conversation. It would be that kind of cultural barrier that is in place and what they've been trained as, how they've been raised to believe. And all of a sudden, God's saying, no, that's okay. You should be friends. God's breaking down a huge cultural barrier at this point. God gets involved to break down the wall between these two individuals and, in fact, these two cultures. Now, let me just address for a moment the way that God historically in the Bible works as miracle. God usually speaks to a person, a individual, a prophet, or, Jesus received many. He says, I only do what my Father told me to do. And so it's God the Father talking to God the Son who did all the miracles that Jesus did. But then if you look at the Old Testament, you find all these other miracles that happened, or you find Peter doing miracles, but it's always God speaking to one who is then either touching or healing or praying or go and prophesy. It's this communication hub that kind of takes place. But there's a couple times in Scripture where God does something so miraculous that he actually has to talk to two sides. And I hate to say it, but there's sides in everything, in every place. And in the church, I could name this side and this side and this side and this side, and probably about 20 different perspectives of all kinds of different sides of things. But see, what God does here is he talks to two sides. Let me point out the first time that this happens. God comes to Mary and says, sends an angel and says, hey, Mary, you're going to have a child. This child is going to be named Jesus. It's going to be Messiah. But you see, that all of a sudden created a cultural barrier, didn't it? Because in that culture, for her as a teen, unmarried, law would have been for her to be stoned. And if nothing less, Joseph would have set her aside and say, I can't marry you. And in fact, that's what Joseph was going to do. Remember, Joseph was going to politely set her aside and hopefully not have her stoned, but definitely not claim that relationship because that would make him unclean. But then God went and spoke to Joseph and said, no, Joseph, this is okay. Because I am the one involved. This child is mine. Divine. So God had to speak to both Mary and had to speak to Joseph to say, hey, that what you thought was unclean is not, because I'm the one who's involved. God is the one who spoke to Joseph to reconcile that relationship. And God spoke to two people in order to make that miracle truly happen. The only other time I'm aware of God doing that in Scripture is this, with Cornelius and Peter. God comes to Cornelius, and by the way, why does God come to Cornelius? Cornelius is not a devout Jew, did not grow up Jewish, cannot go to the temple and worship. He didn't have any experience of that as a child. In fact, when we talk about a conversion experience, obviously Cornelius was worshiping God, believing in God, praying to God daily, and giving to the poor, caring for the community. But he never saw a big bright light like Saul did. He didn't attend a church. He didn't say a certain prayer. He just was living his life as a devout follower of God. So God sends an angel, and this angel shows up and simply says, hey, your faithful prayers have been noticed. Hey, your acts of charity and almsgiving has been noticed. How do we make a determination whether somebody has a relationship with God? Because God's the one who noticed that. Even an outsider who would not have been considered even welcome in the tabernacle. And then God shows up to Peter. By the way, Peter's the more stubborn one here. Peter is the one, and I can't blame him. I mean, I understand what that's like. Peter grew up in a indoctrinated culture. He grew up with a set of rules and a set of dogma that he adhered to strictly. And so the first time God shows this sheet and says, hey, Peter, take your pick and your choice. And all of these things that are listed on there are things that the Old Testament, that God's law would have said, they are unclean, unworthy, do not touch, you cannot eat. They're all off limits. And Peter says, no, God, no, I can't do that. God, you know that I never would eat anything unclean. I would never do that. I won't cross that line. And God says, hey, three times this takes place. God says, never call common or unclean that which I have deemed clean. Peter, who is only holding on to that which he had been taught. Peter, who is holding on to the only scripture that they had, the Torah, the prophets. All of a sudden, God's telling him something that's outside of those texts, and he's saying, this is okay. This is okay. In fact, not only that, but this is good. And Peter had to listen. And Peter eventually says, God convinced me that I cannot call unclean that which God has made clean. I can't imagine how difficult it would have been for Peter to say, okay, I'll go talk to these people, even though everything in me, all of my teaching, all of my scripture, everything tells me that it makes me unclean to go and talk to this people. I can't imagine what it would have felt like to Joseph to say, yes, I'll take this woman as my wife, even though culturally and everything that I know, it makes me unclean. And yet, that's exactly what God intended. For reconciliation of God's people. In this one moment, in fact, think about this. If this one chapter in all of Scripture had not taken place, what would have happened? If Peter hadn't gone and welcomed Cornelius into the church, you know what? We would not have a Gentile church. We wouldn't be here. There wouldn't be a Christian church because it would still be a sect of Judaism and only those who were Jews would be allowed in. See, God was about reconciling humanity and helping us see that all people are of God's children. All people are who Christ died for. In this one moment, God turned Peter's world upside down. And in this one moment, God opened the doors of the church to Cornelius and to all Gentiles. In this one moment, all of a sudden, the reconciliation of cultures took place. Now, I'm sure it took a long time to convince others, as you see that in the Acts church, they continued to struggle with, well, what does that mean? Does that mean they've got to be baptized? Does that mean they've got to be circumcised? Does that mean they've got to do this, this, and this? What are the rules that do fit? And they struggled to figure that out. And sometimes the church struggles to figure out what it looks like to bring different cultures or understandings together, and yet God says, you're all my people. Finally, in verse 34 and 35, Peter opens his mouth and says, truly I understand now that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, everyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. So in both cases, we find Cornelius and we find Peter. Both cases, I believe something happened in their hearts. Cornelius had a conversion in his heart from polytheism to believing in a God of the Jews that he didn't fully understand. And he began living that out by his actions, by praying to God continually, and by giving to the poor. He was living it out in his life. And Peter had a conversion experience too. Peter had a conversion where all of a sudden, those who had been excluded and outside and not welcome in the faith, all of a sudden, Peter realized God saying, no, there's no boundary for people to get to me. He's saying, that which I've called clean, all are welcome. You see, the thing that makes a difference, last week we talked about how it's what God puts in our hand that makes a difference. The things that God gives us as gifts that we can use to glorify God. This week, I want you to notice it's what's in Cornelius' heart that makes a difference. It's his love of God and his love of people. And I want you to notice that if Cornelius hadn't had the courage to speak up, to invite Peter, that none of this would have happened. And then I want you to notice Peter's heart, and I want you to know that Peter's heart was rent as well. It had to be torn and broken and actually step away from that which had been ingrained in him in order that he might love God, but also that he might love his neighbor more fully, because before he was not able to do that. In Luke 12, 33 and 34, actually 34, it just simply says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Brothers and sisters, if your treasure is God, that's where your heart will be. If your treasure is loving your neighbors, that's where your heart will be. You won't have time for the division. You won't have time for the conflict. You won't have time to worry about those things because you're focused on loving God and loving neighbor. Last week, the question was to live a purpose-filled life, give to God what God has placed in your hands. This week, the true message is give to God and give to neighbor the love, the absolute love of your heart. You see it in Cornelius' action, and you see it in Peter's action. To live a purpose-filled life, we must give to God all that is in our hands and all that's in our hearts.